Welcome to the Spherity podcast season Product Passport Pioneers. In this episode, we're speaking to Tilmann Vahle, co-lead Circular Mobility Platform of SYSTEMIQ. Welcome, Tilmann.
Hi, Susanne. Nice to be here.
The new battery regulation mandates for the first time a digital product passport. It becomes an obligation for batteries above 2 kilowatt hours. In this season, we're talking to the people that have an impact, a personal impact, the success of the battery passport. And by leading the German consortium Battery Pass, you're definitely one of those who will have an impact on the battery passport success. Tilmann, but before we go into all these details, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background and what did you do before joining SYSTEMIQ and leading the consortium Battery Pass?
Yeah, gladly. So my background's in sustainability sciences and business. So basically ever since my studies, I focused on breakthrough changes. I worked with the Acatech Foundation that intended to get renewables from the Northern African sun-rich areas into consumption centers, worked with Volkswagen Corporate Foresight to look into innovative mobility systems, and also worked with EY Sustainability for 2.5 years on sustainability reporting, auditing, and consulting.
Okay, super. Obviously, a good preparation for this role. Tell us a little bit about SYSTEMIQ. What is the company about? When was it funded? What does SYSTEMIQ do?
Yes, SYSTEMIQ is a B Corp. That means a for-profit, for-impact company. We do exclusively environmental impact work. So we call ourselves a change company or change-making company. We were founded in reaction to the Paris Accords in 2015. So the foundation in 2016, now a little over 5 years ago, was under the pretense or the idea that we need really quite radical systems change across all economies globally to be able to maintain on 1.5 degrees, and SYSTEMIQ is the vehicle for that. It was founded by the then leaders of the McKinsey Sustainability Branch and the former Commissioner for Research and the Environment, Janusz Potocznik, and various other quite senior and experienced sustainability professionals. And the idea was to scale in a small kind of surgical fast impact vehicle. And so now we've grown to 350 almost people, operate out of the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Brazil, in Indonesia, and we work across the whole spectrum of environmental sustainability. We consult, we call them willing pioneers or fast-moving pioneers. So that's corporates, that's governments, and we collaborate with players across all value chains. And we do analytical work with like large analytical modeling papers and publications that can take several years to come to fruition, set up consortia, sometimes as part of the World Economic Forum, sometimes ourselves, and then we invest ourselves as well. So we've done around 20 investments through our investment vehicle, which has now spun out, so it's now a separate entity, but we've invested into multiple startups that we think make a big impact or have potentials to really make a big impact. And that includes also the tracking and tracing, where we've invested as well.
Okay, do you want to name some companies that we might know in this space?
Yeah, sure. So I think most notable for the battery passport would be Circulor. That's one of the, I guess, leading startups now in the technical metals tracking and traceability.
Yes.
That would be related to the traceability of the metals. We have also invested along the mobility ecosystem, for example, into the routing company that is optimizing the use of buses and trucks. We've invested into BDO, which is a builder of electric vans and refurbisher, just to name a few.
Yeah, that's a quite wide field that SYSTEMIQ is active in this important area. So thank you for giving us here some insight. Now let's move to this very interesting piece of the consortium lead that you do. A consortium has been founded to build the battery pass, and it's funded by the German ministry. And maybe can you give us some details here, how it was funded, when it starts, who the members are, and anything that our listeners might interest?
Yeah, definitely. So the battery pass is a consortium of German organizations, but that is fundamentally directed at supporting the introduction of the European battery passport, as you pointed out in the beginning, which will be mandated starting 2026 to be implemented for all batteries larger than 2 kWh. So essentially, of course, vehicle batteries, but also stationary and like e-bike and scooter batteries or home storage. And the motivation to start Battery Pass came from the Circular Economy Initiative Germany, which we scoped, initiated, and conducted together with acatech, the German Academy for Engineering Sciences, between 2018 and 2020. And there I led the working group on circular batteries. And one of the key outcomes from that, of that multi-stakeholder consortium from sciences and industry, was that, you know, data obviously is the key thing for managing batteries along their life cycle more productively, also more economically, and then of course for sustainability. And so that was one of our key findings from our analysis and consortium work and report. And so we decided to set up a consortium to deliver to that, right? Of course, knowing that there's others as well, like the Global Battery Alliance, of course, is quite well known. Cartena-X is one large player now that has emerged. But we thought that that mix of sciences, so academia, neutral, fact-based sciences, and industry would be real value add to the space. And so that's the reason why we decided to set that up and then subsequently applied for the funding.
Super, and I think it's a very important initiative coming out of Germany, or at least having a lot of German members here. You already mentioned Cartena-X and also the Global Battery Alliance. What is are those projects interrelated with each other? Will you be talking to the Global Battery Alliance and to Cartena-X to make sure that we do not have 3 or 4 different battery pass silos in the end?
Yeah, absolutely. And to start off with, they are definitely interrelated, and I'll get to that in a sec. We are working closely with them, in fact. But before we go into that, also for more framing and maybe background on the Battery Pass, our consortium, because that is important to understand how these work together. Yeah. So basically, for the European Battery Passport, the EU won't describe in absolute last detail in the regulation what will have to be done on each of the dimensions that will have to be reported. You know, probably most listeners will know it's a fairly broad range of requirements that the regulation sets out on sustainability, like CO2, responsible supply chain, but also like more technical things like second life, state of health, and so on. And so these are very detailed technical parameters. And we want to support both their content definition and then also the technical approaches that you could use to implement the Battery Passport. We, as the consortium, want to make suggestions how that could be done. Ultimately, the definition of how it must be done, the EU will probably delegate to a standardization body or various standardization bodies, and will leave to an extent to the industry to decide, right? We, as a consortium, don't want to build the Battery Passport. We believe that there's various actors, Cartena-X certainly being one, as an industry association that's also properly, you know, tech funded, to deliver the various tech elements that are needed, or also build the Battery Passport. We think that what is really needed right now and for the next year or 1.5 is really define and make suggestions how to align the different initiatives and proposals and, you know, various ways of creating these content and tech approaches. And that's what our purpose is, and that's how we also engage with the Global Battery Alliance and Cartena-X.
So what is the concrete outcome of your project? Is it standards? Is it a vocabulary to describe the battery, or due diligence, or CO2 footprint? What is the exact outcome?
We have fundamentally 3 outcomes. One will be an analytical piece that will describe and try to assess the environmental and the economic impacts potentials of the Battery Passport. So that is more of a study, which will start over time. And then the second one is related to the content, how the metrics, which metrics should be described, in which way, under which logics. And so there will be, you could call them guidebooks or standard proposals. We are not a standardization body, right? So we're not like DIN or ISO. We don't standardize ourselves, but we have all the people in the room to make suggestions how to do it. The third one is a proposal for a technical and interoperable system, kind of a draft or a prototype demonstrating also how that could actually be technically done, like some other organizations are already doing. Our point here that we want to make is that we need a system that is interoperable, largely open source, obviously compliant, but also one that really supports this growth of digital means of digital product passports. And that is focusing on the digital product passport for batteries, so battery passport, but ultimately should lay the kind of, you could say, horizontal principles for digital product passports overall, which, well, you know, the EU will also call for, according to the Eco-Design Directive, for various other industries. And so that is the contribution that we want to make there.
Super. So this well fits into, as you said, the more technical approach from Cartena-X and maybe the Global Battery Alliance, where the industry comes together, also giving their input on the data that they need in there, because the Global Battery Alliance includes the entire value chain for batteries, and then you come in and support this with maybe also making suggestions for standardization and making suggestions for also the legal input, I guess, for the legislations that is about to come, because we also know that more delegated acts and more information about a general product passport legislation is upcoming. And did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, that's a good summary of it. And maybe that's a good time to share our consortium members. Because that of course shapes also where we bring our USP, our additional value to the discussion, and where we are distinct from others. So we're a fairly small consortium, different to GBA and Cartena-X, which are of course like really large, powerful organizations. GBA also being global. Our group is a German one, since it's funded by the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection, and therefore also only German organizations could receive those funds, but all of these organizations operate fundamentally globally. So we have the value chain starting with the OEMs down through battery, through the performance materials, and also sciences. So we have on board both Audi and BMW as large automotive companies, and of course also involved in digital product passports elsewhere. We have BASF and Umicore as recyclers, respective performance materials producers, and also very deeply involved in the GBA. We have the Fraunhofer Institute for Production Machinery, IPK, and acatech as scientific partners and technical partners, you know, especially for the work package 3, which relates to the technical standards. And we have the innovators. So we have Circulor, I mentioned in the beginning, right? We're invested in them, so we know quite well what they're doing. We have TWAICE as well, a young startup from Munich that is looking at battery analytics, so for during the lifetime phases, and also VDE Renewables and FIWARE, VDE Renewables being a technical and auditing consultancy, very deep in battery tech, and FIWARE being an open source standardization organization that, you know, creates open source standards for smart city and the like. And so together we built our consortium, and I think have a nice range of, you know, that mix sciences, impact, SYSTEMIQ being the impact organization. That's our primary goal, making this good for society, good for the environment, and the industry, to get really, you know, the on the ground insights.
And now you already named a few companies that also are members of the Global Battery Alliance and are also a member of Cartena-X. And I think that shows that the industry wants to keep the initiatives together, making sure that we don't have different silos in the end, but a good solution that we can actually use 2026 for the battery pass. So thank you for giving this insights here. Yeah, you already mentioned the eco-design for sustainable product. This will have an impact, and it just has come out. So how do you deal with this? The new requirements in there, will those be already considered in the project? Do you already have a plan how this impacts the project?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, we're aware, and in fact, also contributed on the sidelines to some of the content bits of the Sustainable Product Initiative that resulted in the Eco-Design Directive draft that has just been proposed. And we're very, very glad that the digital product passports have taken such a prominent role in the Eco-Design Directive. I think that's an amazing signal to the entire industry, or entire economy really, across the EU, since it really covers so many of the key industries and economic spheres and ways of life in Europe, and really has a good push to digitalize further our economies for innovation. And obviously that is just a draft, right? And so until the Eco-Design Directive draft will actually pass into the new legislation, it's going to take several years. I mean, in the ideal case, maybe 1.5 to 2 years. But looking at where the battery regulation came from, that on its own took more than 2 years, and it's still not quite finished. It's a lengthy process, so we don't exactly know what will be written in the upcoming Eco-Design Directive. That said, already now we see great kind of landing places where we can expect this to roughly head on. So what we're doing right now is we map the requirements for digital product passports from the Eco-Design Directive with a very nearly final draft of the battery regulation, and we'll take that into consideration as a sort of second order priority. So to see what can be matched, what can be translated to universal digital product passports.
Yes, and then also divert back the outcomes of your work maybe to the legislation, to shape it further, to make it more fitting to the industry, I guess.
I mean, that's ultimately the hope, right? Where, as I said, what we develop is really an offer of a substantiated industry and fact and science-based proposal for how to get digital product passports off the ground. And so we'll put that out into the open for one consultation, right? This is not only our group, but we want to make a proposal that we call on others to comment on and engage with us once we get, of course, having some work done first, but in half a year or so, we want to bring that out for public consultation. And with that, really have a robust contribution and proposition how that could be shaped, both for battery passport and digital product passports overall. And by the way, as you mentioned it, we're also actively reaching out to consortia that are currently starting work on digital product passports as part of the Support Act fundings that have been given out by the Commission. So we're really engaging with the entire value chain.
I think that's also an ingredient for success, to keep aligned with the different initiatives. So it's good to hear that from you, Tilman. The digital product passport concept in general, what do you think of it? I mean, it brings us more information, and the promise is that you can better recycle, reuse, and repair products, batteries in particular here. Can you give us some examples? What can be repaired better or recycled better, or maybe lead to a second life? Which data are we looking at? I know that you have very in-depth knowledge about batteries and so forth. Maybe give us an example where this can work better with more information from the digital product passport.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, it's probably a case-by-case discussion. It's too easy to say, well, data will fix things, and that's obviously not true. And to get the data into sufficient quality is a challenge, right? It's not going to be a free lunch that just happens to fall into our laps. But for batteries to start with, them being probably the most valuable product that will receive a digital product passport, maybe next to buildings. Vehicle batteries especially can cost several, will always cost several thousand, but maybe 10,000, 20,000 euros for the high performance premium large batteries. So highly valuable, highly complex, high-tech products, and that are fundamentally digital to begin with, right? I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, a vehicle battery is never off. Once it's created, it will always be on and managed through its battery management system. It's not a passive, a passive offline thing. It's thoroughly digital. And so getting for one, the data on all the inputs that are in the battery, which can be hazardous, right? Like cobalt is a heavy metal, or lithium is flammable, right? As we all know. It's for one important to have safe handling of these batteries. Yeah, so it's really useful for a logistics company, for example, that handles end-of-life batteries, or for that matter, batteries during its lifetime, to know specifically this battery is safe. So that is live data that must come from the battery management system, but must be provided in a safe and standardized way, and can basically, they call it green label such a battery. So say, this battery, it's healthy, there's nothing wrong with it, it's in good temperature, it's in good shape, it's safe to transport without further safety measures. So that's one big thing. Right now, it's extremely expensive to transport vehicle batteries due to the hazard that they have. So that is one big one. There's really a lot of benefits for CO2 transparency as well, to get much more accurate CO2 data that can only be done with a consistent digital system. And then also to recycle them efficiently is really helpful to know, again, battery state of health, to handle it, but also what materials are contained, to get really the process is optimized for those specific chemicals. So that's just a few options or ways where the data from the passport will help.
Okay, but thank you. This is exactly the examples that make it better understandable for our listeners what exactly should be in the passport and what we're trying to reach with it. So thank you for this nice examples. The European Commission is asking for a decentralized system to host the digital product passport. This is obviously where companies like Spherity come in, also as associated partners of those projects that you mentioned, and also as member of the Global Battery Alliance. Our technology promises to help with the interoperability that you mentioned. Help also with data verifiability and immutability, making sure that there's no fake data in there, to make sure that all you mentioned before, the use cases, are actually also safe. And also no central system is needed to host the digital product passport. Where do you see those promises, where do you see the strength here of the decentralized approach that has been demanded from the European Commission?
I think it's really key to highlight that that kind of principle, right? And first and foremost for data security reasons, but also for efficiency reasons. So many of the information that will be required, for one, have different levels of access that will be required, right? Some will be for consumer access, which is free to use and should be available to anybody. Others are more sensitive because they're business to business and might have proprietary information attached to them. And then there's thirdly also one level that is really should only be given to the government for compliance checks, and might be highly sensitive also from company side. And especially those second and third categories, is highly valuable, and therefore could also become, if stored centrally, become a target, for IT attacks essentially. And for that reason, I think a decentralized approach is definitely prudent for many of these, but not for all data, right? So I think a mix of centralized, decentralized might be useful also to see, decentralized might mean that the updating of the data or long-term availability of the data might be harder to organize. So there's a few questions that need to be answered and warranted, but overall, I think it makes for a much more efficient system and a safer system to prioritize decentralized approaches as much as possible. And of course, just for scale, we're talking about billions and billions of data points for these millions and millions of batteries, and storing and organizing those centrally, just like the sheer administrative effort to replicate data that is in large parts existent elsewhere already, would be an incredible amount of work. And
not to forget the thousands of actors that are involved in there.
Absolutely. Hundreds of thousands, right? Like from the consumers to thousands and thousands of companies involved, and many of which aren't European, right? Also important to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
To get many of the data points in the battery passport involve the entire supply chain. CO2 is a prime example. Like, to get the full and detailed CO2 footprint of a battery is not like measuring once, right? But like for the manufacturing, you will have battery factories that are maybe somewhere in the EU, maybe not, but definitely have a global supply chain that feeds into them. And to get the right readings and detailed information, you involve dozens of actors right away. And so that needs to be organized efficiently so the systems, you know, don't create additional costs. I think the large majority, frankly, right, and that's important to keep in mind, exists today or is feasible today. You mentioned Spherity has a few key technical components ready to use, essentially, or ready to refine for battery passports, and other solutions from the W3C or you know, GS1 obviously being a well-known identifying organizations as well. Like many elements, or the vast majority of elements exists, right? So it's a matter of smartly configuring them so we get a system that is efficient and really works out to complete the promise of the battery passports.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing that I also want to mention, because of the thousands of actors, not every actor is a large company and a large mobility OEM. There's also a lot of small companies involved. And I think what's very important is to include them and make sure that they can attend or participate this ecosystem. And therefore, I find it important to mention for those that maybe do not know that yet, that the decentralized technology that is envisaged to implement the product passport is actually implemented as reference implementations as part of the currently running Gaia-X notarization service or reference implementations currently going on, and therefore will be available as reference implementation, as free piece of software, if you want, by the end of the year, which allows all those actors to more or less free participate at the ecosystem. Of course, maybe they have to integrate it to systems where they hold the data that they need to contribute to the product passport or the value chain. But the technology to participate is actually already there for free very soon. And I think that's also an important success factor for the battery pass, if you ask me. Yeah. Did you want to reply or?
No, I agree with you totally. I think especially for the SMEs along the value chain, it's going to be crucial that the participation becomes valuable and you know, low cost for them. And on that point of valuable information, I think it's often, well, it can be seen that the battery passport is a one-way street, right, where people need to comply and upload information just to have some front end for some data for the corporates. And I think it can't be further from the truth, right? Ideally, and that is where decentralized systems come into play, and also principles of mutual interaction and reciprocity are super critical. This could be, or is meant to be, the source of so much valuable information along the entire value chains, along the entire economy, especially also for SME, to create new markets with access to data that previously may, you know, only have been available to some select actors. And so I think that is quite key. We are currently working with the CINE Foundation on, we published a paper with the CINE Foundation on the global data commons, describing principles like that, right? Reciprocity, to, you know, you provide data, but you also receive and are able to actually use those. And so I think this is a great promise for the EU economy to create, you know, much more value add, greater products, greater services in a resource productive way, right? And so that is the real promise of digital product passports, I think.
Thank you for summarizing this so nicely, Tilman. Where do you see the biggest hurdles building the battery passport from your experience in the industry, or maybe from the stakeholders that are all in there? Because we have to consider that a lot of competitors are also in those projects, and we need to make sure that we keep everyone in the project.
Yeah, of course, this isn't, you know, ready off the shelf, and one challenge relates to getting the data in some parts, and one relates to aligning on passing them through. The first one especially on the global upstream supply chains, getting far upstream CO2 footprints or data on responsible supply chains. Yeah. We need to keep in mind that these are fairly complex, right? I mean, responsible supply chains could be various parameters, like several dozen maybe of human rights, environmental aspects, and so on. Often the data doesn't even exist, and so creating those data, there's tech companies that are going upstream and generating them reliably, right? You mentioned that immutability and reliability is super important, right? So getting accurate, reliable, efficient data from upstream, that is a challenge, but which we need to fix anyway. And so I think this is a great impulse to get this on the road. The second one is the transfer, and as you mentioned right now, or just now, the different proprietary interests or individual interests, with companies obviously having economic interests to maintain, and that's great, right? That's why we have a free market economy. Them having to work together to get this set up can be complicated, right? Because you might have different interests of where the data sits and so on. And so I think that's a challenge, right? Setting up the system so everybody benefits. And that is, where we want to contribute fundamentally, right? To get like a consortium view of, even competing companies, like we have Audi and BMW, yes, obviously competitors in many ways, but, in the same boat at the same time. And so this is a proof case in itself. Can we make this work, that we have companies that work proprietary, work open source, that work in the same space, have competitive natures, but also, collaborative nature. So it's really a proof case of that.
Yes, and I think the decentralization of the setup will help, because actors keep the data by themselves, have a self-sovereign attitude to the data, can control it, also control the access. Who may access it and who may not access it. And I think this will help also, as an intermediate or intermediary between those competing actors.
Definitely.
Where do you see the product passport in 5 years and in 10 years? Where are we?
So in 5 years, I think we'll have, basic implementation of the battery passport. Hopefully, right, because the law will be required by 2026, and hopefully also some other sectors. Though again, the law will take a little bit longer and to define this for other sectors. But fundamentally, we'll see it working out, and we'll see the information coming through to the consumer, and first businesses starting to build their business models and development on especially battery data. And then in 10 years time, I think, we do have the chance to have it broadly sweeping across the majority of European economy, to really provide a lot of data that is useful and structured also, right? Structured, therefore useful across the whole range of companies, but also society, which will help, by the way, legislate better, right? And really validate, do these legislations make sense? Do we have effect? Should we tweak these, And so I think in 10 years time, we'll see the first effects for climate protection, for investments into sustainable technologies and economic activities.
Absolutely. And maybe for those, our listeners are mainly from the industry. What is your final and most important statement for them?
That would be, take this as an opportunity. Take the digital product passports as an opportunity to engage and help constructively shape the technical and the content implementation of these, to make it successful, to make it as useful for your organization as possible, and to take that opportunity to help, take this as a leverage for bringing the EU into a climate neutral, circular, sustainable future, which is competitive on the global scene.
Wonderful statement. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all those insights, Tilman, with our listeners, and thank you for helping making this world a little bit greener.
Thank you, Susanne. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.